Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court, other court issues, as well as CPS. I am your host, Maryann Petri. You can find me, my books, and blogs on dismantlingfamilycourtcorruption.com, as well as on Amazon, and the books are on audio as well. I have a brand new guest. I have Esther Deutsch on. Now, she's been in court for 6 years at Nassau County Supreme Court Matrimonial Center, which also handles the family court. Now, she hasn't seen her kids in over 5 years. The court will not give her supervised visitation because she posted about her son's abuse on Facebook in a non-harassing and non-threatening manner. Now, her oldest is 22. She's married. However, they illegally put her name on an order of protection without her knowing about it at the time. And she herself never filed a motion about it either. So this is kind of illegal, kind of. And her ex apparently is wealthy and he does not mind spending money on useless lawyers that enjoy spending his money. And he does this also to torture her and her kids. This is also called legal abuse. Now, Esther herself has also dumped money into 4 attorneys herself. And we'll get into part 2 right before we end part 1. But I welcome you, Esther Deutsch. I'm so sorry you have gone through all of this.
Thank you. Thank you, Maryann, for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm glad to have you on to speak out. A lot of people are very fearful of speaking out.
Yes. Actually, I'm gagged by the court, so I'm not allowed to speak out, but I'm doing it anyway, because this is important. And the gag orders are there to, cover up the corruption of these court criminals. So
Mhm.
it's incredibly important to speak out. Um, I'm going to start with a brief introduction, some history about my ex and my marriage and how we got to, how I, you know, got swept up into this family court nightmare.
Mhm.
So my ex and I, we were married for 20 years before I filed for divorce
Mhm.
and an emergency order protection on behalf of my 3 children. I met him when I was very young. I was 19 years old and he was 23. We dated for about 2.5 years, and we were married in September 1998. We're both from Orthodox Jewish communities in Brooklyn, so getting married young is fairly
Mhm.
typical. Throughout our dating life, I mean, there were red flags. He lied compulsively, he cheated, but he always managed to convince me that he didn't lie. He was very convincing.
Mhm.
He's the most persuasive person I know, and I would believe him. I
Mhm.
was very naive, and I was his perfect victim. Um,
I'm really glad you brought that up because a lot of young
yes,
people don't know this stuff when they are dating. You and I were
right,
naive, so it's good
absolutely.
we're telling this because a lot of people, even young guys, they don't know this stuff either. So I hope there's young guys listening to this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're right. And also, another thing is he would love bomb me and compliment me to no end. And I didn't know then that he was using that as a manipulation. I
Hmm.
thought it was genuine. But they use it as a manipulation and a distraction from their bad behavior.
Hmm.
He was never violent with me when we dated. But he was the first time he was violent with me was on our honeymoon. I walked into the bathroom and he was in front of the mirror. I think he may have been flossing or something to that effect. And he shoved me really hard across the marble bathroom floor. I fell, of course, and hurt myself really bad. I was bruised for days after. And throughout our marriage, he would alternate between being very nice and loving to being very cruel and abusive. And so it created this Stockholm syndrome where I became um, basically trauma bonded to him. And I
Hmm.
became addicted to the times when he was nice and loving. And I dissociated from the times when he was cruel and abusive. He would also engage in relentless gaslighting, where he would steal my personal belongings on a daily basis. He would steal my phone, my car keys, my credit cards, my eye cream, and then he would help me look for these items. And often he would find it, quote unquote, find it. And when he would find it, I would thank him for it. I'd be grateful to him. I
Hmm.
would say things to him like, "Thank God my head's attached. What would I do without you?" Yeah. And if he really wanted to torture me, then I would never find those items. Like he derives pleasure from inflicting suffering on others, and this gave him pleasure. Even when I would engage with him and confront him about stealing my stuff, he would just, he would make me feel crazy. He would say things like, "You're paranoid, you're delusional, you're always destroying the peace, you're imagining things, you need help, honey, you really need help." And then he would say something like, "Why would I take your phone?" Which is a very logical question for a
Hmm.
normal person. Um, and so he engaged in this relentless mind messing. And he enjoyed these toxic dynamics, these exchanges that we had. He would stay home from work just to engage with me, to let me know how crazy I am, that I'm paranoid for thinking that he stole my stuff. Another mind messer is that he's pretends to be a very pious Jew. He's prays fervently 3 times a day, pretends to be devoutly religious, and yeah. So
So
finally,
he
yes, go ahead.
he's like your basic Christian hypocrite that I
Not
deal
much
with.
different. Yes, exactly, exactly. We're people that use religion, as their mask to
Exactly.
hide who they really are, because you know evil doesn't want to be investigated, so they have to work twice as hard
Hmm.
to mask the evil. um Finally, in May 2018, at that time uh my mother was very sick. She was battling cancer,
Mm.
and it made me realize how fleeting life is. And I had this flashback to my own deathbed and what would be, my regrets. And
Mm.
that empowered me to start standing up to my ex and his abuse. And so in May 2018, I confronted him about raping and strangling me several years before, while when we still lived in Brooklyn.
Mm.
At that point, we were living on Long Island. We had moved to Long Island in 2016. Um, so I confronted him about raping and strangling me. I don't remember the exact date, and he uses that against me to discredit me.
Hmm.
But if I would have actually marked the date down, then it would have forced me to confront the fact that I was a battered woman and I didn't like feeling like a victim. It was too difficult. Like, the reality of it was too difficult to deal with. I had 3 little children to care for. And so the way that I coped was to dissociate completely from the abuse, start fresh and new every day, and shove everything under the rug.
I think a lot
When
of people do that.
Exactly, exactly. Especially, people that are suffering from abuse and trauma. That's just it's a way to cope.
Hmm. And the stress of what your mother was going through.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and so when I confronted him about raping and strangling me, and when he strangled me, it was to the point where I couldn't breathe and I couldn't catch my breath. I was gasping for air. He was very, very quiet. He wouldn't meet my eye. He was shocked that I confronted him. He didn't think that I would. And soon after, he just apologized. He just said, I'm sorry, as if he stepped on my toe, just very casually. And that upset me really, that made it even worse. That made me angrier. If he would have apologized genuinely and meant it, I probably would have let it go. I would have
Mhm.
forgotten about it. But then after that, for weeks after, he kept going back and forth between admitting and denying that he raped me. And that just made me so angry. It just fueled me to continue standing up to him.
Mhm.
And that's what I kept doing for months after. And then about 6 months later, on November 3rd, 2018, um, my son disclosed to me that his father had been sexually, I'm sorry,
Mhm.
that his father had been sexually abusing him since he was little.
Mhm.
Um, that day was a Saturday. We were about to sit down and eat lunch as a family. And it was the first time that I dared to stand up to my ex in front of our kids. I would never disrespect my ex in public, in front of the kids or anyone else. I mean, we
Mhm.
had our fights in private, but never in public. And that day was the first time that I stood up to him in front of the kids and I yelled at him that he was manipulating and brainwashing our son, which he
Mhm.
was.
Mhm.
And so we're yelling at each other, and he has a really loud voice. He's yelling over me. So at a certain point, I just give up because he's drowning out everything that I'm saying. But my son is watching me very carefully. And then after, I said, okay, we're done. And I just, called it quits because I couldn't yell and scream at him anymore. And my son asked me quietly if he can speak to me in his room.
Mhm.
And my ex saw this exchange, and he knew that what my son was going to tell me was important because it was his, he has these secrets to hide. And so my ex asked my son to go with him to shul, which is synagogue,
Mhm.
um, prayer service. And my son said no, which was the first time he said no to his father when his father asked him to go with him to synagogue.
Mhm.
And my ex had to leave. It was right before, it was nearly 2 p.m. and my ex had to leave to synagogue because in Judaism, there are 10 adult men required for prayer service. It's called a
Mhm.
minyan. And my ex was the 10th man that they were relying on, so he had to leave. If they weren't relying on him, he would have never left the house because he knew that my son had something important to tell me. And so I went upstairs with my son to his room, and my ex followed us and asked my son again to come with him to synagogue. And I said to him, I said, you heard what he said. He doesn't want to go with you. And so he had no choice but to leave. And I'm in my son's room sitting on his bed with him, and he's clearly terrified. And he starts telling me that he said, he said, when you're not home, I'm so afraid when you're not home because she doesn't make me feel safe. When I'm alone with her, I don't feel safe when you're not home. And he kept referring to a female. And
Mhm.
so I was confused in the beginning. I didn't know what he was referring to. And I asked him, is it Jennifer? Jennifer was our housekeeper at the time. And he said, no. And he kept repeating it.
Huh.
I don't feel safe when I'm alone with her and you're not home. And I asked him my oldest daughter's name, and he said, no. And again, he kept repeating it and referring to a female. I asked him if it was my youngest daughter's name, and he said, no. And by now I can tell, there's something very serious going on. He's very distressed. He's afraid. And I made sure to stay calm. And then finally, he was able to say, Tati, Tati doesn't make me feel safe when I'm alone with him and you're not home. Tati is the Yiddish word for daddy that my kids use, to call their father.
Mhm.
And after that, he proceeded to tell me the unspeakable things that his father would do to him. Um, and then after my son confided to me, all the pieces of the puzzle started to make sense. All the time I took him to the pediatrician since he was little because he used to complain that his private parts were hurting him, and he had, irritation and rashes and swelling and whatnot without getting into the gory details. And sometimes I would take him to the pediatrician several times in a month.
Mm-hmm.
And the pediatricians covered it up. They knew what was going on. I was completely oblivious. It wasn't on my radar that it was even possible that my ex could possibly be abusing our kids. And the pediatrician that we had in Brooklyn, his name is Dr. Joseph Valva. He covered it up. He knew exactly what was going on. He's a mandatory reporter. He should have reported it. And then my children's pediatrician, Dr. David C. Mai in Cedarhurst, also covered it up. And he would give me all sorts of ridiculous reasons why my son's private parts were hurting him. He said, maybe his pants are too tight, so I got my son bigger pants. Or he said, maybe he's drinking too much juice and not enough water, and that's making his urine thick. So I would water down my son's juice,
Mm.
So yeah, and over the years, my son would tell me, Ma, you're not tough enough. You're not tough enough. And he said this with tears in his eyes. And I would laugh and say, I am tough. Of course I'm tough. I had no idea what he was referring to. It was his way of communicating to me that, he wasn't safe.
Mm.
Um, and my ex does have a history of molesting children. His sister accused him of raping and molesting her for many years.
Mm.
She's 6 years his junior,
Mm-hmm.
and he did this. He molested her also when he was an adult and she was still a child. But never did I ever imagine that he can do this to his own children. I thought he was a good father. He would insist on taking the kids to school every morning. But now I see it was just a way for him to control the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so after my son confided in me, disclosed to me, 3 weeks later, my mother passed away.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I filed for divorce soon after and an emergency order of protection. My first attorneys that I hired, their names were Jeffrey Schechter and Kara Miller. Um, you know, when I filed for divorce, like I had no idea that, things were going to get even worse, you know, um,
Mm-hmm.
and my children's nightmare was going to get even worse with family court. I was naive and trusting, and I thought, you know, the judge is going to be horrified. The professionals involved will do the right thing, and I'll be able to get supervised visitation for my kids.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, but my first attorneys, they kept stalling to file for the emergency order protection. So finally, a month later, after I retained them, they finally filed for the emergency order protection on behalf of my kids. And, the day they decided to file was the day that our judge was out that day, which is interesting. So the first judge in our case was Judge Jeffrey Goodstein, and he's the supervising judge of Nassau County Supreme Court. Um, he's and since he's a supervising judge, he gets to pick his own cases. So he picked our case.
Mm.
But the day that my attorney, Jeffrey Schechter, filed for the order of protection, he was not in. And so it went to Judge Hope Zimmerman. She was the substitute judge that day in Nassau County Supreme Court. And she refused to come out of chambers and give me an order of protection. And so instead, my attorney uh, drafted a stipulation, and I signed it. And in there, my ex was to get supervised visitation that Sunday for 4 hours, which is fine, which is that's what I wanted. I I wasn't looking to bar my ex from all access to the kids,
Hmm.
but I just wanted my kids to be him to be supervised with our kids so that he cannot abuse them emotionally, sexually, physically, in any way. My ex also agreed to leave the marital residence,
Hmm.
um, as per the stipulation. But what he did was he filed a motion 9 days later for exclusive occupancy of the marital residence and sole custody. But and and just to give some context about Judge Hope Zimmerman,
Hmm.
she was the judge in the Thomas Valva case, the little 8-year-old boy that was murdered by his father, Michael
Hmm.
Valva.
Hmm.
And so she basically signed Thomas's death warrant and
Hmm.
took away custody from the Valva boys' mother, Justina, and gave custody to the father, Michael Valva, who eventually murdered Thomas.
Hmm.
So there's definitely a pattern here in Nassau County Supreme Court as far as not protecting children from abuse and taking away children from protective mothers and handing them to abusers. And, that's something that I would have never believed unless I went through it on my own, that um, protective mothers, when they tried to protect their kids in court, that they the children are taken away from these, protective mothers and given to the abuser. It's just unbelievable. This is also very well documented by law professor Joan Meyer of George Washington University. She There's a study that she did, that that demonstrates how protective mothers lose custody to the abuser in family courts.
Right, right.
Um, Now, okay, and so the next my next second court appearance is January 25th, 2019. And this time we're in front of Judge Goodstein for the first time. And my attorneys casually just state on the record, all they say is the mother believes that the son is being abused by the father. That's it. They don't ask for an order of protection, nothing. And then also in the motion that they drafted, it was also like an afterthought about my son's abuse, when the entire reason why I filed for divorce and an order of protection in the first place was because of my son's abuse. And Judge Goodstein, his response was, how do we resolve this? That was it. And then, yeah, that was it. And then he casually launched into conversation about his wife going away for that weekend to some sort of convention or seminar. And that was it. The hearing was over. No
So,
order of protection was issued.
so he says, how do we address this? Then he starts talking to the attorneys about his wife going on some trip.
Yeah, it was surreal.
Um, I'm glad you brought this up about this behavior. It seems like uh, they all do this. I mean, there are some good judges out there, but they're few and far between. I only had one
Right.
good judge, right?
Right.
Uh, so, and then he didn't issue the order of protection.
No, no order of protection, nothing. And my attorneys didn't explicitly ask for one. They were just simply supposed to ask for one. They never did that.
See, and the thing is, you're paying them to work for you,
Exactly.
and they didn't do that. And I'm hate to say I'm glad you brought that up, but when I was walking to the courthouse with my attorney, she said, "Don't bring up any abuse." Like really quick. She said, like real quick. And I'm like, you know,
Yeah.
I didn't know what to think of that.
I know it's unbelievable. I mean, these attorneys, like you said, good ones, good ethical matrimonial attorneys are few and far between.
Hmm.
I've yet to have one. They and I've had five attorneys in my case, and every single one of them has done more harm than good to my
Correct.
case.
Correct.
And you're paying them hundreds of dollars an hour.
Right.
Um, and my attorney, so going back to Jeffrey Schechter and Kara Miller, it became very obvious to me that he was sabotaging my case. But at first, it was very hard for me to believe because, I'm new to all this. Um, I'm thinking, I'm thinking, an attorney looks out, he's going to look out for me, look out for my best interest. Um, but
Mm.
it became very apparent that he was looking to sabotage my case. And I'll give you examples. I mean, if I were to go through every instance of, how my attorney sabotaged my case, we could be here for days.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
but I'll give you some examples. Um, so okay, so yeah, January 25th. So I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to this hearing and I'll show you how my attorneys, were clearly not looking out for me. After this sham hearing, my attorney, he told me I need to leave the courtroom and I can't come in. And he stayed in the courtroom. He stayed with opposing counsel. Her name is Jessica Ressler and Gail Berkowitz, who was the court appointed guardian ad litem, also known as the attorney for the child.
Hmm.
She's supposed to be the so-called neutral
Hmm.
attorney for the child.
When they're actually third-party parasites.
Exactly, exactly. She's there to enable the judge's agenda.
Hmm.
And so he told me I can't come into the courtroom. He drafted a stipulation without discussing anything with me prior. And then he coerced me to sign the stipulation, which would or give my ex visitation with the kids every other weekend for 3 days, including overnights. And his parents would be the supervisors, which is
Oh,
a joke because his parents are his biggest enablers. And then in addition to that, he would get he was able to come over to the house every Monday and Wednesday and do have dinner and do homework with the kids. And for that, he got to choose his own supervisor. Basically, he could bring whoever he wants to be his supervisor, which is also a joke.
hmm.
Um,
Boy, that was mishandled.
Unbelievable. And then, of course, my ex is all of a sudden he wants to do homework with the kids when I was the one who mostly did homework with the kids every night. And
Hmm.
so I signed the stipulation, and because you're under all this pressure from your attorney, you're new at this, you don't even know what a stipulation is. I had no idea that a stipulation means that once you sign it, it's not reversible. You can no longer get relief from the court if you sign a stipulation. After this meeting, I sat with him in the conference room, and my attorney said to me, he said, if you withdraw from court, I'll make sure that you get several $1 million in your divorce settlement, which is, he's not allowed to do that. And of course, I said no, because at that time, I'm still thinking that I'll be able to protect my kids and get supervised visits for them. It was also like a few weeks later, my ex would also send me a written settlement agreement, also offering me several millions of dollars if I withdraw from court and agree to share custody with him. He was basically asking me to sell our kids to him, and that was never going to happen. I can never live with myself knowing that I didn't do whatever it takes to get supervised visits for my kids.
And then on top of that, if you did sign that, say you did, he still might not even give you the money, right?
That's true. That's a good point. Absolutely. Yeah, with him, you never know. Absolutely. And now to go back to my attorney, what we were discussing before about attorney sabotaging cases. Uh, so my mother's unveiling was in Israel in February, and I wanted to take my kids to my mother's
Mm.
unveiling. So I asked Jeffrey Schechter if he can get written agreement from the other side that if it's okay for me to leave the country and take the kids. And he kept telling me he refused to get anything in writing. He kept telling me, go, go, you should go. I'm telling you, you can go. And something told me that that's not right. It
Mhm,
didn't
mhm,
make sense to me that he wouldn't get written agreement from the other side.
mhm.
And and he was encouraging me to go. And it just became so obvious that, if I would have left the country with my kids without anything in writing from opposing counsel, then I would have been arrested for kidnapping. And yeah, so after that, I fired him. Um, it was just, I mean, he was clearly not looking out for my interest or my kids' best interest.
Right.
Um,
And had you left and gone to Israel with the kids, and I've had people talk about the Hague conference, all that. If you had left with the kids and gone to Israel, I don't know if Israel is compliant with the Hague.
I have no idea.
I
I wonder
thought
about
they
that.
weren't. For some
That
reason, I thought they were one of the nations that weren't. I mean, I could be wrong, but yeah,
Yeah, no, I have no idea as far as that. I But what opposing counsel did say weeks later, they said, the mother was going to kidnap the kids and leave the country. So
of
she
course.
obviously knew about this somehow. But yeah, my own attorney kept encouraging me to go without having anything in writing.
Mhm.
Um, so after that, I was on a, a quest to find the best attorney in Nassau County. And I was told that Stephen Gassman is, the best attorney. He's very politically connected. And so I hired Stephen Gassman and his associate, Michael Dabb. Um, and my, I was hoping that he'd be able to turn my case around and I'd finally be able to protect my kids, but things were no different with him.
Mhm.
Um, in March of 2019, the CPS report came back unfounded. And, not that it's not surprising because CPS is not in the business of actually protecting kids. In the
Right,
Valva case,
right.
there was 17 unfounded CPS reports from Nassau County CPS, the exact same CPS uh, as the unfounded report for my son regarding my
Mm.
son's abuse. And in the Valva case, there was overwhelming evidence of the boys being abused to the point where the teachers called in to
Right.
CPS.
And they were ignored.
They were ignored, exactly. So yeah, and so my attorney told me that because the CPS report came back unfounded, Judge Goodstein does not feel that there needs to be a hearing for the order of protection, which doesn't make
Mm.
sense because one has nothing to do with the other. When you
Mhm.
file a motion in court, you're entitled to due process, which is a hearing. Um, and yeah, and then he somehow manipulated the situation where my ex and I were basically forced into this informal custody schedule where my kids were going back and forth every 3 days, which is very chaotic, but it
Right.
was a schedule. It was a schedule that my ex wanted, and my own attorney catered to my ex's
Oh.
preferred schedule. And he told me after, he said, "Oh, it's just temporary, just for this week. We'll be in court next week and I'll change it." Of course, he canceled court the next week and it never happened. And every time I asked him to change it, asked for a hearing for the order of protection, he would say, you know, he, the judge won't agree to do it, and the law guardian won't agree to it, and all that. And as far as the um, AFC, the law guardian, I'm just going to refer to her as the AFC from here on.
Mhm,
Gail
mhm.
Berkowitz. So my first attorneys, Jeffrey Schechter and Kara Miller, told me that I may not speak to Gail Berkowitz at all. I may not ask her questions. I may not speak to her about the abuse, my kid's abuse. Yeah, this was another way he was, obviously not looking out for me and my kids. And I believed
Oh,
him. I thought it was, some sort of a part of law, procedure, whatever
oh,
it is. And I didn't speak to her at all about the abuse. And it makes no sense also if she's protecting my kids and she's there to protect their interests, how does she not have any questions for me? How does she not
right.
demand a hearing from the court? Instead of demanding a hearing from the court, she would also be the one to try to deter the court from having a hearing.
I'm glad
Um,
you brought that up because I have heard countless story, one after the other, where the good fit parent is never interviewed.
it's unbelievable. Yeah.
It's constant.
Hmm.
That's why they have got to get rid of these AFCs, guardian ad litems, hence third-party parasites.
Exactly. Absolutely. Not just don't they want to speak to me off the record, but they certainly don't even want me to put anything on the record. And a
Hmm.
hearing would mean that my testimony gets put on the record. So yeah, it was unbelievable that she wouldn't ask me any questions about the abuse, did not want to speak to me. Um, she's, she said, that, oh, we don't need a hearing because Dr. Yohananoff, who was the court appointed, also so-called neutral custody evaluator, his report was due in court soon. So, that wouldn't be, a hearing is not necessary. But finally, in June of 2019, I insisted on speaking to Gail Berkowitz. I told my second pair of attorneys, Stephen Gassman and Michael Dabb, that I would like to speak to her. And so finally, 6 months after I filed for the order of protection, I finally get to sit down face to face with her. And I'm telling her the details of my son's abuse. And all she had to say, her very flip response was, well, that's your perspective. Yeah, that was it.
Useless.
Exactly.
Oh,
And
so
obviously
sorry.
doesn't care about my child who's being abused.
Mm-mm. Okay, so
Um,
these people were getting paid off?
um, you mean if I knew that she was also getting paid by my ex in addition to her billing,
Hmm.
but billing me directly and billing him directly?
Have you seen those bills?
Yeah, I ended up paying for most of it in the end.
Oh no.
Yeah, the court, it's like adding, insult to injury, where
Hmm.
I was forced to pay for most of custody, um, the custody evaluator, the forensic accountant, and there ended up being two AFCs, attorneys for the children in our case, and I ended up paying for most of it in the end, in the final, as per the final divorce decree. Um, and so I keep pressuring for a hearing for my kids. Um, and then finally in June 2019, the court issued a decision and scheduled a hearing date for June 20th, 2019. The hearing for the order of protection, finally. But my attorney, Stephen Gassman, refused to do it. He refused to go ahead with the hearing. He said to me, he said, it doesn't pay. to have two trials, which made no sense because he's talking about a custody trial that's way off and not scheduled versus an emergency order of protection trial that's needed on an emergency basis. It
Mhm.
made no sense, but he refused to do it, refused to prepare for it. And so on June 20th, 2019, we're in court. Judge Goodstein is nowhere to be found. He's in his chambers. He doesn't come out of his chambers. The attorneys went to speak to him in chambers. After that, they came out, drafted a stipulation,
Oh,
and then my attorney, Stephen Gassman, handed me a stipulation to sign. And in that stipulation, there were two things that were included that also clearly indicated that he was sabotaging my case. So the first thing was that he wanted me to sign that I will not speak to any third party about my case, which means that I can't even speak to a family member or a friend regarding anything having to do with the court and my divorce, um, which is, unbelievable. And then the next thing is that he wanted me to sign that I agree that my ex should have unsupervised visitation with the kids. Now, of
oh,
course, I didn't sign that either because that would mean that I could never seek relief from the court
yeah.
and get a hearing from the court for the order of protection. But that was precisely the point. And this is after being in chambers with a judge.
Hmm.
And I refused to sign it. I had him take out those two things. He was not pleased. And I am so desperate at that point. I don't know what to do. My son is clearly being abused by his father. Every time I drop my kids off at their father's rental home, it's like dropping them off into the lion's den.
Hmm.
And then my ex would stand by the door and he would give me this evil smirk,
They all
like he was
do.
getting
Mm.
exactly like he was getting this pleasure from inflicting suffering on me and the kids. And he would give me that evil smirk in court as well when no one's looking. And then as soon as somebody saw him or looked at him,
Mhm.
he would assume this very victim-like, humble demeanor.
Oh, yes. Know that
Yeah,
well. Yep.
yeah, exactly. And so I'm desperate. I go to the DA's office to see if they can help my kids. They turn me away and tell me to go to family court. So I went to family court, which, just to clarify, there are two courts in Nassau County that handle family matters. It's family court and the matrimonial center in Nassau County Supreme Court. They both they're both essentially the same thing, and the corruption is alive and well in both. So I go
Mm-hmm.
to family court, I get a refrain from, which is useless. Uh, I needed a stay away order, but they wouldn't give me a stay away because I had a stay away or a stay away pending in Nassau County Supreme Court. And and ultimately my ex, got the refrain from dismissed because his attorney, Jessica Ressler, she lied under oath and said that I had a hearing coming up the next month in Nassau County for the order of protection that I filed in the Supreme Court. So that was a lie.
Hmm.
But in any case, my attorney, Stephen Gassman, was not happy that I went to family court to get that order of protection. And so he withdrew as my attorney, which was perfectly fine because, I'm spending all this money. And again, these attorneys are doing more harm than good.
Oh, they sure are.
Yes,
Do you,
absolutely.
do you ever look
Yeah.
back and think, maybe would a criminal attorney have helped better?
My fourth attorney was also a criminal attorney,
Mm.
and he was not able to help me get even supervised visitation with my kids. So, yeah, I tried that, and unfortunately, that didn't work.
But
Um,
was he
yeah.
helping you, or do you think he was knowingly sabotaging your case?
Um, Out of all my attorneys, 5 attorneys, he was probably the best one,
Hmm.
but still, the best one um, couldn't go up against the judge. They're too scared to go up against the judge. Those scenes where you see an attorney going up against the judge, you only see that in the movies. You don't see that in real life. I mean, certainly not in family court.
Right.
And um, and these attorneys, what they'll do is they're not willing to to risk their entire career for me, their one client. So they have to um, abide by the judge's agenda because they're counting on repeat business
Hmm.
and they're going to be in front of the judge again and again and they're going to be networking with all these other attorneys again. And
This is the
so it's
problem.
correct. So it would be political suicide for them to do the
Mm.
right thing, unfortunately, you know. But then just don't take my money. Don't take my case. Tell me that you do not take cases um where children are being abused. I mean, there's one attorney that I know that's ethical enough to not take cases where there's child abuse involved,
Mhm.
and that's Raoul Felder. And
Mhm.
precisely for this reason, because he knows that the judges will give custody to the abuser. He actually wrote about this.
Mhm.
And so, all these other attorneys, this, they have enough experience to know that the judges will hand custody to the abuser. So then
Mhm.
just don't take my money,
Right.
do the right thing and stay away. Don't take my money. Don't tell me what I need to hear when I retain you and then completely change your tune after.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I mean, so they continue to bill you for things that are not helping you. And conflict is good for business. So they
Mhm.
promote conflict because then they get to bill. And so yeah, so Stephen Gatzman withdrew as my attorney, and I'm pretty much out of money at this point.
Oh.
And so I have to I should have known by then that hiring an attorney or being pro se, it won't make a difference either way. It's going to be the same difference.
Mhm.
But I'm still hoping, maybe another attorney will, do the right thing. And so I hired Brindy Berkowitz. She was the cheapest attorney I was able to find with the cheapest retainer that I put on my credit card.
Mhm.
And she lasted less than 2 months
Mm.
because, again, she was clearly networking with opposing counsel, with Gail Berkowitz, the attorney for the child, the judge. I kept asking for a hearing. She kept telling me, stop asking for a hearing. It's
Oh.
not a good idea. Um, and on August 8th, I have to take my son to the urgent care center
Mm.
because, it was just devastating. He was being abused, and I he needed to be checked out and have an exam done. And so I didn't take him to his pediatrician because I knew his pediatrician, Dr. David C. Mai, was covering it up. So I took him to the urgent care center, hoping that that doctor would be better. But that doctor barely looked at him and just gave me a prescription for a cream. And it's just incredible to see how these doctors are also they're looking away, they're not doing the right thing, they're not protecting kids,
Mhm.
um, and they're mandatory reporters. And I'm I'm just I'm at my wit's end. It was so I emailed Brindy Berkowitz, my attorney, and I said to her, I have to take my son to the emergency room for an exam. Um, And she said to me, if you take your son to the emergency room, you will lose custody by the end of the week. Then another thing she wrote to me in an email, she said to me, these words. She said, "Stop trying to fix something that you admit has been going on for years." This is my own attorney telling me to look away from my son's abuse.
Well, then
And so,
that also makes her a child abuser.
oh, absolutely. They're all complicit in endangering the welfare of my children. Absolutely, for sure. So, when she withdrew as my attorney, I was perfectly fine with it. Um, and at this point, I'm completely out of money, and I'm not even sure if hiring another attorney will make a difference. And so I proceed pro se for the next 4 months after that. And I kept asking, at least now I get to ask the court directly for a hearing.
Hmm.
So I kept asking for a hearing, did not get a hearing date. I emailed the principal law clerk to Judge Goodstein, his name is Stephen Maffei, to ask him if my motion was still open or I need to file another motion for an order of protection. He confirmed that my motion was still open, but yet they weren't giving me a hearing date. And in November of 2019, finally the custody evaluator's report came into the court. So, the so-called neutral custody evaluator that was appointed by the court, his name is Dr. Alberto Yohananoff, also known as Avi Yohananoff. And he submitted a 64-page report to the court that was full of bias and lies and inconsistencies. After evaluating me for 17 and a half hours, he concluded that I have an unspecified personality disorder with paranoid features. So after 17 and a half hours, he couldn't name this very ambiguous personality disorder. And nowhere in his report was he able to cite a single instance of paranoia.
Hmm.
The
And
only, yeah, go
oh, I'm
ahead.
sorry. Is he? And he's a doctor. Is he? I don't know. Like, is he a psychiatrist doctor type? Because some
Yes,
people.
he's a psychiatrist.
Okay, so he couldn't even name a personality disorder. Boy, he's really inept. Where did he get
Yeah.
his license online?
Sounds like it,
Yeah,
you
I'm so
know.
sorry to interrupt. Go
I
ahead.
Yeah, no, no, it's fine. Um, so yeah, that was unbelievable. I mean, and also
Mm.
the only instance of paranoia that he claimed was that um I had this unshakable belief that my son was being abused by his father. But that wasn't paranoia, that was the absolute truth. And in the conclusion of his report, he recommended that my ex get custody of our kids because of my unjustified restricted gatekeeping, which is another term for PAS, parental alienation syndrome, which is a junk theory that was created by um, a pedophile apologist and psychiatrist Richard Gardner, who committed suicide, but yet his junk theory is used in court.
Yeah, they should completely throw all that out because he's not reliable. And Bob Hoffman in 1967 wrote the book um, Negative Love Syndrome. And in chapter 9, page 75, he coined parental alienation. So, and he was not a pedophile. So,
Right.
the courts have got to get away from this Gardner thing and start
Absolutely.
focusing on why are these abusive individual parents taking and stepping in and trying to isolate the child from the good fit parent. They've got to
Exactly.
stop it. They shouldn't
Yeah,
even be using that in
absolutely.
court,
Absolutely, they should not. But it's the reason why they use it is because it's to divert attention
right?
from the abuser and now put the attention on the protective mother.
Mm.
You know, that's why these custody evaluators are appointed in the first place. It's to, they take mothers like myself that had no history of any mental illness, no, history of any mental health episodes, and all of a sudden I'm branded as crazy and delusional.
Oh
That
yeah.
makes no sense. That makes no sense. Dr. Yohananoff, even in his report, he wrote that I had been a good nurturing mother to my kids and provided a stable environment for them, but that I have suddenly become disruptive due to my unshakable belief that my son is being abused by his father. Now, any psychiatrist worth their salt knows that for 42 years, I was 42 at the time, for 42 years, if somebody's okay and they have excellent mental health, they don't all of a sudden just go crazy, just like that.
That's
That
what
makes
they
no
did to me.
sense.
And what they did to you, they did
Exactly.
to me and other people.
Yeah,
And I even know a good fit dad. This is going, he's being put through a meat grinder, but they did the same thing to me. The opposing attorney pointed at me and said, she's mentally ill and she's alienating the kids from the father. And it's like, how does a registered nurse of 23 years and seasoned suddenly turn crazy?
exactly. It makes no sense. It
It's
makes
all
no
about
sense.
money. These are money courts.
100%. And the forensic evaluator also relies on repeat business from the judge. If he delivers what the judge wants, the outcome that the judge wants, he will get more business from the judge. And they
Hmm.
make so much money on these reports. My ex paid him $104,000 for two reports. I eventually end up paying for most of it in the end. But initially, he was paid $104,000 for these two reports. So, they're incentivized
Hmm.
to lie. And and
Very
so
true.
yeah, and there's all sorts of games that he would play during the evaluation. For example, I told him that my daughter was terribly afraid of her father
Mhm.
when when she couldn't sleep in her father's rental home. She would pace back and forth all night. And then when she would come to me, she would just crash because she was so exhausted from the
Hmm.
lack of sleep. And so what Dr. Yohananoff did, he called my ex and asked him to bring my daughter in, not me. He didn't ask me to bring her in because he knew that when he asked her, "Are you scared of your father?" that she would say no because her father's sitting right next door, you
Right.
know?
Right. And he would be driving her back. I mean, these
Exactly.
poor kids have to live with these child psychological abusers as well as whatever.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Whenever there's physical and sexual abuse involved, there's always emotional abuse as well.
Right.
It goes hand in hand. And so, yeah, I mean, and it doesn't even matter what kind of education Dr. Yohananoff got as far as his degree is concerned. If there is not, if they're not ethical, if a professional is not ethical, it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter regarding his education and how competent he is.
Mm.
It's all the most important thing is how ethical they are and to do the right thing.
And of course they won't because they're getting paid so much money.
Exactly, exactly. It's all about the money and they're incentivized to, be unethical. Um, and so in December of 2019, I am feeling hopeless, helpless. My kids are suffering terribly with their father. Um, and what I did, so on December 2nd, 2019, I posted on Facebook that my son is being abused by his father. it was very out of character for me. I was always a very private person.
Hmm.
I didn't even confide in some of my close friends about the abuse. I thought that, I'd be able to get supervised visitation for my kids and nobody would have to know my dirty laundry.
Right.
But at that point, I'm just so desperate. It's a last resort. And I know that my ex had other victims, and I'm hoping that, maybe someone out there is another one of his victims and they're willing to come forward
Hmm.
and help me. I had reached out to his sister several times, and unfortunately, she refused to help me.
Oh, then that makes her a child abuser as well.
Exactly. Exactly. It's absolutely. I mean, she said to me, well, you're a mother and I know you're going to do the right thing for your kids and do whatever you need.
But
While
you,
her testimony, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
right, no, you're right. If you had her testimony, you would have won this.
It certainly would have made a very big
Right.
difference. And, how can how she, look, I have, I have sympathy for what she went through as a child with him, but she's an
Mhm.
adult now. She has
Right.
6 children of her own. How does she have a heart to let my kids suffer
Mm.
with, this monster that she knows,
You know,
um, yeah.
it's too bad, like before you married this guy, it's too bad she didn't, take you aside and say, this is what happened to me. Be real careful.
So yeah, you're right. Before I was married, I had no idea that he
Hmm.
did this to his sister. It was 2 years into our marriage that I found out that he molested his sister, but she was never the one to tell me. He was actually the one who came to tell me that this is what he said to me. He said, his sister is so crazy. She's delusional and paranoid. She thinks I molested her and did these things to her in our basement. But you know what? I don't even remember a thing she said to me. I don't even know what she's talking about. She's crazy. And you know what? I
Oh,
believed him. I believed him, which is another red flag.
right.
When somebody tells you that everyone was crazy in their, previous life or ex-girlfriends or whatever it
Hmm.
is, and he would tell me that his ex-girlfriends and his ex-fiance, they were all crazy too. That's another red flag.
Hmm.
And so I believed him because he's so convincing. And And then I was able to get it recorded on audio. It's actually on my Facebook page where he admitted to his sister that his sister confronted him about molesting her and doing terrible things to her in the basement. And they've been estranged for over 25 years at least. The rule is that when um, he's not allowed to be in the same house as her. So
Hmm.
one time when we took our kids to visit my in-laws, her car was outside,
Hmm.
her minivan, and he couldn't go into the house. So I went in with the kids to visit my in-laws, but he had to stay outside. He couldn't go in because, he's not allowed to be under the same roof as her. So
Whoa.
clearly, she's very traumatized, but I wish that she would help my kids and have the empathy to come forward
Hmm.
and help them because her testimony could make all the difference. Um, and so, yeah, so I posted on Facebook about my son being abused. I posted about not getting a hearing in Nassau County Supreme Court for nearly a year for the
Hmm.
order of protection that I filed. And several days after that, I received an email from Judge Goodstein's law clerk that they're ready to go ahead with a hearing for the order of protection. So I'm thinking, great, this worked.
Hmm.
But, that wasn't the case at all. And I'm going to get to it. Um, and so on December 11th and December 12th of 2019, I gave 2 full days of testimony regarding my son being abused by his father regarding the long history of domestic violence that my ex perpetrated against me, um, his alcoholism, him driving me and the kids in the car while being drunk, and he did that often. Um, but that wasn't enough for Judge Goodstein, the 2 full days of testimony that I gave. He needed another day, a third day. And so I was to continue giving testimony the following Monday on December 16, 2019. And now, during my 2 days of testimony, there are at this point 2 attorneys for the children that were appointed by the court. So there was the first one, Gail Berkowitz, but then she told the court that there's a conflict of interest. She was trying to convince all 3 of my kids to be with their father, and my youngest daughter gave her a hard time and refused to agree. And so that was her conflict of interest. And so the court hired a second AFC for my youngest daughter, only to control her and to alienate her from me.
I
And
was
her
just,
name,
yep.
go ahead.
I was
Yeah.
just going to say that. Continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And the second AFC that was hired by the court, her name is Jill Stone. And what they both kept doing during my testimony was they kept cross-examining me and objecting to every time I tried to put my son's abuse on the record. They kept objecting that it's hearsay. It doesn't make sense. They're there to protect my kids. Don't you want to hear my testimony and then determine, you know, what should happen? And of course, there's that double standard where they were allowed to put hearsay on the record all the time. Like they can,
Oh, yep.
they can say what my kid's therapist said and what my kids say. That was fine. But here I am trying to get protection for my kids, and they're basically acting as my ex's attorneys instead of my kids' attorneys. And my ex had his 2 attorneys there as well, Jessica Ressler and Meredith Kenyon. At the end of my 2 days of testimony, Judge Goodstein told my ex, he said, this is what he said $10,000 for her and $10,000 for her. He directed my ex to pay each of the attorneys for the children $10,000. Basically, reward them for the good work that they did for you today.
He's disgusting.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the 2 days, so after my testimony for those 2 days were done, I asked Judge Goodstein if I can see my son and if I can be with my son, if my son could be with me for the weekend, because at that point, my ex was withholding my son from me since December 2nd, when I posted that first Facebook post about my son being abused. And there was nothing that I can do because there was no custody order from the court. And so when I went to pick up my son, because it was my turn to have him, my ex would not open the door, and he called the cops on me and told the cops he lied. He said that we had a verbal dispute, and that wasn't true because I didn't even speak to him at all that night. He
So
wouldn't open
then,
the door.
okay, so that he's doing custodial interference, which is a felony, and that's kidnapping. So
Right.
it was your time to see your child, and he withholds, and they don't do any penalization to your ex.
No, none at all. None at all. You know, and speaking of, him getting penalized for, doing things like that, I'm just going to go back for a second because it just reminded me of something.
Hmm.
When with my second attorney, Stephen Gassman, Gail. So at that time, Gail Berkowitz, there was one attorney for the child at that point, still, Gail Berkowitz, where she handed Stephen Gassman a fake attendance list showing it was completely fabricated, showing that I am not sending my son to school, and it showed that my son was missing 10 days of school. Now, thank God, when I dropped my kids off at school, I had the foresight to take a picture every single time because I knew that my ex was looking every which way to suddenly brand me as an unfit mother.
Mm.
And he was you just never know with him. And
Right.
so I was able to prove to my attorney, Stephen Gassman, I have these pictures. This attendance list is clearly fabricated. So it was
Hmm.
fabricated by my ex or by my ex in collaboration with my son's school, who has been enabling my ex as well. But Stephen Gassman did nothing about that. He didn't go back to Gilbert, didn't put it on the record that my ex fabricated an attendance list. Nothing. It's
Hmm.
not documented. Um, so yeah, he's not, he can do whatever he wants. He doesn't get held accountable for any of that. And he can, you know, defy judge court orders,
Hmm.
he can get away with all that. Um, and so
Let me
yeah,
ask
yeah, go.
Let me ask you
Sure.
this. Your ex's attorneys, did they have any connection with this Judge Goodstein or Jeff Goodstein? Did they have
Yeah,
any?
so absolutely. So Stephen Gassman and Judge Goodstein are good friends.
Mm.
But you would think that it would, I was told he's so politically connected, he knows the judges and he's friends with Judge Goodstein. I thought it would help me, but again, even if he's a competent, seasoned attorney, if he's not ethical, he's just not going to do the right thing by
Mm.
his client.
So
And so
sad.
yeah, exactly. So he and the judge were completely aligned. Um, and so, yeah, so I asked Judge Goodstein to see my son, and Judge Goodstein tells my ex to bring my son in the next day for an in chambers meeting with him. And he tells my ex, don't, you're, have someone else bring him to court and don't tell him where he's going and why. And I said to the judge, he's going to be afraid,
Hmm.
but I think that was the point, to scare him.
Hmm.
And so the next day he had a 2 hour um, in chambers meeting with my son. And when I tried to get the transcripts, they wouldn't give it to me. They told me it's sealed and I can never see it, which it just makes no sense that a judge can have private conversation with my minor child and to keep that conversation from me. And whatever transpired, I don't know what transpired during those 2 hours, but a few days later, I went to try to see my son in school and he ran away from me like he was absolutely terrified. And it made no sense. My son was never afraid of me.
Mm.
So, I don't know what was told to him, but he was so, so terrified.
So this judge, Jeff Goodstein, this child psychological abuser, talked to your son for 2 hours?
2 hours, yes,
That poor kid.
absolutely. And not to tell him where he's going and why. I mean,
Who
obviously,
does
like,
that?
exactly, exactly.
I mean, when my kids were talked to, there were attorneys present as well as the, court stenographer. And I was able to read all transcripts. Nothing was, thank God, sealed.
Right.
But
And
I mean,
well,
I was playing with a bunch of sociopaths like you were. I mean, this is just terrible.
it absolutely is, you know. Um, yeah, that a judge can do this and keep this information from the child's mother. It's just it sounds very off and very wrong.
Hmm. It sounds
Um,
illegal.
absolutely, absolutely.
I
And and then after this meeting with my son, Judge Goodstein issued an order that my son cannot be with me for the weekend, and I cannot see my son, and he didn't give a reason why. And I was heartbroken. I felt physically sick. I was not doing well because I
mm,
was so sick with worry over my son being with his father and my girls as well. No child is safe with my ex. And so I really was not doing well that weekend. I felt so sick. I went to a doctor on Sunday, got a doctor's note, sent it to the court that I'm not going to make it in the next day to give testimony because I just physically did not have the strength. Um, And then my ex took that as an opportunity to file an emergency ex parte order of protection against me. So he did that the next day, Monday, December 16, 2019. He filed for an order of protection based on my Facebook posts, my non-harassing, non-threatening, truthful Facebook posts about my son being abused by his father. It was my public outcry for help,
Mm-hmm.
basically. And Judge Gustine granted it to him immediately. And this is while the hearing for my order of protection is pending.
Oh, that they had
Um,
disregarded for months.
correct. At that point, nearly a year. Nearly a year. Um, and Judge Goodstein recused himself a few weeks after this without giving a
Oh,
reason why. Yeah, I mean, he threatened me that he's going to throw me in jail if I don't delete my Facebook posts. Of course, I didn't believe him. I didn't think it was possible to jail someone for free speech at that time. So he recused himself from my case. And the second judge on my case is Judge Thomas Rademacher, who's a complete tyrant. He's temperamental. He's clearly mentally unstable.
hmm.
And, they always accuse you of being that which they actually are.
Exactly.
Um, yeah, like in the court transcripts, he said to me, he said, "You're delusional." I'm sorry, not in the court. In court, he said to me, "You're delusional." And in the court transcripts, it was changed to, "It's like it's delusional." So, I mean, they tamper with the transcripts.
Hmm.
And, even, I mean, I'll give you another example how they took out an entire thing, but even changing a few words will change the entire context of a sentence.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and so January 6th, 2020, I'm in front of Judge Rademacher, and he declared my 2 full days of testimony that I had given Judge Goodstein. He declared that a mistrial without giving a reason why. And when I asked him for a new hearing date, he said, "We're not looking back, we're only going forward from here on." Could you imagine? I mean, a clear violation of due process.
Mm-hmm.
He also handed back to me a flash drive of supporting evidence of my son being abused by his father. I had given that flash drive to Judge Goodstein, and he said to me, "This doesn't belong to the court." And I told him it's important. It's supporting evidence of my son being abused. It's supporting evidence to Dr. Yohananoff's report. He's like, "No, this doesn't belong to the court." He made me take it back. My ex also filed a motion for exclusive occupancy of the house to take away the marital residence from me. And so he did, just like that, without a hearing, took the house away from me, basically put me out on the street with clothes on my back. And my ex also filed a motion to hold me in contempt of court for my Facebook posts, for exposing him, for abusing my son. And Judge Rademacher told me that if I don't remove my Facebook posts, that he's going to incarcerate me. I didn't believe him, just like I didn't believe Judge Goodstein. Um, but he did. He had me. Uh, I was handcuffed with, my hands behind my back, like I'm a violent criminal. When the actual violent criminal was my ex that has custody of our kids.
Hmm.
And I was sentenced to 30 days at Nassau County Correctional Facility. Um, Again, this is all for posting a public outcry for help for my son. The next day, I was taken to Judge Rademacher's court again on January 7th, 2020, from jail. And he threatened me, he said, "If you don't remove your Facebook posts, I'm going to increase your sentence from 30 days to 60 days. And nowhere in the court transcripts do you see that he mentioned 60 days. You don't see that. They took that out. because again, they tamper with the transcripts, they edit the transcripts. The reason why there's this very antiquated system of stenographers is so that they could manipulate the transcripts.
Hmm.
There's a much easier way. You can just audio record the court proceedings and have it'd be cheaper, easily available to all parties, and it would be 100% accurate. But yet they still, insist on using stenographers. And so the 60 days was not in my court transcripts. And I did not want to be in jail for 60 days. And so I agreed to um, remove those Facebook posts. Later that day, I was released from Nassau County Correctional Facility. And later that night, I deactivated my Facebook account, and that would stay deactivated for the 4 years after that.
Oh, they have no respect for the First Amendment.
Oh, oh no, not at all, because the First Amendment is their greatest threat. Because
Hmm.
that's how, if you have free speech and you can speak out freely about the corruption, then, they're exposed, and they wouldn't be able to get away 5 minutes with their corruption and the crimes that they commit against children if
Hmm.
there's free speech. So they have to gag litigants, especially protective mothers
Hmm.
like myself. We're gagged.
Right.
Um, And then, and so the next day I'm in court again, January 8th, 2019. And Judge Rademacher, he forced me to hire a fourth attorney when I didn't even want to at that point. I had given up on matrimonial attorneys. I had
Hmm.
lost faith in them, and I had no money. But
Right.
yeah, he intimidated me. If I didn't say what he wanted on the record, he would motion for the bailiff to come up behind me and to cuff me. And of course, that's not on the court transcripts because that's a motion that he does with his head and his hand. That won't show up on the court transcripts.
Hmm.
And he basically coerced me to say yes to getting a fourth attorney. And so I had no choice. I had to hire another attorney because, with an attorney, they can control you a lot easier. Without an attorney, I get to speak and, put the truth on the record.
Hmm.
And my experience with my attorneys is that they're less likely to do that.
Yeah, that is the truth. You know, would you like to come back for a part two at this point?
Sure.
Because I
Yes. Thank you. Thank
is
you
this a
so
good time
much.
to end it for the part one or part one?
Sure. Absolutely. We can end it now.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
hang on.
sure.
Oh, if anyone has any questions, how do you want to be reached?
They can reach me by email. My email is Esther Deutsch 2024 at gmail.com. And Esther is spelled Esther. Deutsch is Deutsch.
And I'll put that in the podcast notes, but Esther, don't jump off,
Thank you.
okay?
Thank you so much.
Sure, there's more to come. Slam the Gavel is a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in these courtrooms. I'm your host, Maryann Petri. You can find me on Spotify, YouTube. Please like and subscribe, Apple iTunes, iHeartRadio, Google, and other platforms even I don't know about. Again, feel free to buy me a coffee to help keep this podcast going. Thank you, Esther Deutsch, for speaking out. Everyone needs to hear this. This is very important information. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Definitely.